Hello and welcome to History Lessons for Roleplayers. Now I actually see a lot of potential in mining history, but and there's plenty of places online that you can watch lectures, whole channels on television that you can hear the chronological, usually it's a chronological description of what's going on. And I thought that I would take more of a history as gossip approach, which is the way I view it. And also I thought it would be useful to add some context to a fantasy role play by looking at different periods of history and maybe taking us out of the cliche Tolkien influence campaigns. I love the man, but he's sort of stunting the potential and wonder of fantasy role-playing. I swear that will be the last editorial. I'm going to play nice. And so in the first installment here, I thought I'd start pretty much at the beginning with the Egyptians. Part one, because there's going to be a lot to talk about. Now, I'm going to treat this like a lecture. It's going to be informal. I'm actually not reading from a script, and I have an outline, of course, and I want to stay... I don't want to stray too much, and I don't want to be too historical or too pragmatic. I want you to find the culture as fascinating as I do, but I also want to emphasize the fantastic elements that could be presented by the Egyptians. So let's talk a little bit first about the Egyptians. And you cannot talk about the Egyptian culture without talking about religion. Herodotus, one of the first ancient historians, said that the place was just sick with religion, and it's very much true. And if you ever get a chance, wonderful time to go to Egypt and visit all the archaeological sites, or just visit them online with Google Earth. You can see how much the ancient culture was actually influenced by religion. Now, when they first invented farming in the world, about 8,000 BC, you had an abundance of food that you normally would not have when we were hunting and gathering. And that abundance of food allowed a certain segment of the population to become idle. And they looked for work for themselves, and many of them became kings and bodyguards and priests. And Again, I don't want to editorial too much. We're all going to have our own views on religion. But the Egyptian religion had the blessing that where many cultures would need 19 people to farm in order to feed that extra 1 in 20, the Egyptians probably got it down to 1 in 4, even 1 in 3 could actually sit there and look up at the stars, wonder why man existed, and explore some of the great concepts of humanity. And in a fantasy world, that meant meeting the gods. Because you cannot talk about Egypt without talking about the terrible closeness of these Chimerian gods. And what do I mean by Chimerian? All the Egyptian gods had human form, somewhere a little bit off-colored, but they were all basically immortal-looking with strange, bizarre heads. Now, you can go online and find plenty of examples of Egyptian gods, but I'm going to just talk a little bit about the majors. And the first thing I want to say about the Egyptian gods is they're immortals. You cannot kill an Egyptian god. I mean, if you want that sort of activity, if you've driven your player characters up to an unbelievable level where they can threaten the gods, I would think you actually would have more fun making them gods themselves and toying with humanity. But the immortal nature of the gods, even the gods themselves could not kill the gods. And they tried many times to kill Osiris, the god of farming. They tore him into pieces and threw him all over. And a lot of times it was always in some sort of personal vendetta, jealousy, and rage. The gods themselves were very close. The humans that studied and prayed to the gods wanted to see human elements in the gods because they wanted all, perhaps secretly, maybe not all, wanted to have not just an affinity with the god, but a full understanding of it. Now, the gods of Egypt, since you had close to a 3,000-year culture, they changed dramatically. But above all, you would have a god like Ra. Now, he had several names over the period of history in Egypt, but Ra is sort of an ancient morph transformation. It's sort of a finesse of a more ancient idea of fire. Fire was generally worshipped and had been worshipped even by the Neanderthals, but the actual worship of fire changed in Egypt and became this god Ra, and the personification, of course, is every day that fireball crosses the sky. Ancient people had no idea what that was. They knew it was important to life. They knew at times it was fatiguing to be under. They knew at times it was warming and comforting. And so you had that visual representation of each day Ra would be born in the sky. And that's what they thought. They thought that Ra, where the Greeks thought it was a man riding a chariot, pulling the sun, the Egyptians actually thought that the sun itself was a god, and it would be born each day from its mother, the night sky, and it would pass through. It would eventually be consumed again, only to be reborn again in the morning. And there was different phases of the sun, very famous of the moon, that could take on aspects. So Ra would be a god that had many forms and many personas. And under Ra, probably you would have Anubis. Now Anubis, and I'm remembering here, I believe it's one of his brothers. A lot of these gods were a big family with their own sort of squabbles and difficulties, but Anubis decided that he would take care of, if Ra was going to take care of the sky, Anubis would take care of all the ground under the sky. And at first Anubis was simply just another form of the agricultural god Osiris, but it changed over time to where Anubis actually represented death and everything under the ground, the decay of that, the transformation of what a living life looks like. And humans for about 150,000 years had been taking their dead and doing something with them. They weren't just leaving them in the caves. And the rituals got more and more fantastic, and in Egypt they probably hit their pinnacle. And so you had even a separation in Egypt itself. If you were on the western side of the Nile, that was the land of Anubis. If you were on the eastern side of the Nile, that was the land of Ra. Now, what can you do with a fantasy campaign like this? Well, you definitely can have more of your alignment classifications, and you can move the evil forces over to a western side of a river and the good forces to the eastern side. And so the greeting of the sun would be something seen as a very lawful and honest practicing, and the praying for the night to come when most of the thieves and mischiefs would come out, that would be seen as more of an evil. And that would be personified by a worship on one side of the river by Ra and a worship on the other. Now, the Egyptians didn't necessarily worship Anubis, they more feared him. There was a whole set of priesthoods. It employed thousands upon thousands of people as priestess of Anubis, and these were not people that offered counsel. They would not go out to homes and do like modern practitioners would do and comfort the living. No, they had nothing to do with the living. They were preparing the dead, because the Egyptians thought that life did not end with death. You just simply had a transformation to a spiritual realm, but that transformation, especially according to the priests of Anubis, required a great deal of ritual. Now, before I get into some of that, which is going to be the major topic of this discussion, and I hope I don't go into 7 hours here, but, I find it fascinating. Hopefully somebody out there finds it fascinating as well in this conversational tone. Let me talk a little bit about Hathor as well. Now, Hathor is a goddess, and one of the major goddess. And the gods of Egypt and the goddess of Egypt, they were equal. They all had supernatural powers and were immortal. Hathor represented with her bull or cow, sow head. She had a role of a mother goddess. She probably morphed from some of the more even more ancient ideas of the Mother Earth god. And Hathor, again, would be the wife of another god, and she would give birth to her own sons and daughters who would have principal roles in the religion. Why did they need so many gods? Well, that's really a hard philosophical question, but I think the major thing you can say about having a multitude of gods is you have somebody to blame. It's tough when you only deal with a single god, because when times get tough, you wonder why that one god has deserted you. But when you're in a role of like ancient Egypt, there are many times people, peasants, up to the nobles, they'd trade up. They would find that if one god and one family seemed to be doing better, they would adopt that other god for their own. And also there was a large degree of forced conversion, of course. If you are the landlord, you want all of the people living in your apartments that you own to worship your god, because there was also this human need to be right. And the more people that worshipped your deity also added a validity to it. And I think you should see that in a fantasy game as well. When the priests of the party come wandering into town, one of the first conversations they should have is, what gods do you worship? There's a great scene in Conan, a movie, John Milius, where Conan and his friend Subutai are talking to one another about what gods you worship and which gods are better. There's always going to be that constant. They were pretty much the sports teams of the ancient world, the gods, and they would point the finger at one another. Now you'll find that Thoth in the ancient Egypt comes into a lot of stories, a god of magic, and certainly in a fantasy world he would take a more, even probably a third-party role, either as an arbitrator between his brothers of the god of life and the god of death, or he would have more of a cultist type following that people would be afraid of Thoth. Now Thoth is separate from Set. Set originally was just a snake god, but eventually became a personification of mischief because over time, all the theology changed. Every earthquake in the ancient world needs to be described. Droughts and floods need to be understood because they would allow people to regulate their lives and live safer and live, more with more hope. But Thoth would probably, in a fantasy element, as a god of magic, would be elevated. So let's go down into the actual Pharaoh himself. Now, the king. The Pharaoh is a form of king, but it's much more than that. It's definitely a god emperor. Although you'll probably find that most pharaohs are just one hit point. They lead an extremely pampered life. The pharaoh is almost like a symbol. It's a child, and in many periods of Egyptian history, it never even left the palace. It was a figurehead. It was married to thousands of women as tribute brides, and he would produce thousands of offspring, which would be scattered around as various clerks and bureaucrats and representations. They'd also be traded to other kingdoms as captives. You dare to break a trade deal, I'm going to kill one of your sons here that I keep in my palace, and you'll do likewise for me. Now, the one role that Pharaoh had was that everyone who was immortal on the earth prayed to Pharaoh. There'd be a lot of rituals that priests would do to the actual gods themselves, but those were ordained by Pharaoh, and usually the better, or I should say the more prominent rituals, Pharaoh would attend. But Pharaoh was seen as the only person you can actually pray to. He was the mouthpiece. He was the one that could receive the prayers to send them on. Now, was he, dittoing all of the prayers that were coming through the kingdoms? Certainly not. He would pray for the big issues, mostly prompted by the priests. Pharaoh allowed stability. It was more than just a king that could come to power and then fight with one another. The ritual actually to decide who was Pharaoh fell through a bloodline that made the female role, his sister, so important, because she actually, through their incest, consecrated the fact that Pharaoh was legitimate. Whenever a pharaoh was born, a prince was born who one day would become pharaoh, it was important that some other woman, bride of the last pharaoh, his father, would have a daughter that he could marry, so that the two of them would ensure this special bloodline. They would call it the blood of Horus. Horus is another personification out of Ra. It's another god of regeneration. It's the falcon. The falcon would be something that could fly across Egypt, and people would look at it and go, well, that thing's gotta be amazing. And in a fantastic world, if Horus could actually come down to earth and tell the priests, well, you need to find a female that this guy is going to copulate with, or you're not going to actually have a king. And the players might, have their own little role in all that, but more than likely what it means is that coming up in the campaign is going to be a great deal of instability. Now, I wanted to keep this PG, but just for you adults listening, you can run with your imagination here on how difficult it would be to run a bloodline in the ancient world where the mortality rate on a lot of females was quite high, and where Pharaoh himself might, especially a sheltered pharaoh, might have some proclivities that would make him disinterested toward bearing children for the crown. Let's go right into the burial rites, because this is where you really get into the heart of something like Dungeons and Dragons. Now, the Dungeons and Dragons, I think, were always pictured as the Mines of Moria. They were pictured as a place that was built by dwarven kind, dug out by dragons. Maybe they had a little bit of that sort of Pit in the Pendulum feel that you got in Edgar Allan Poe. But if you really think about dungeons and Dungeons and Dragons, you're talking about Underworlds. You're talking about a Swiss cheese mentality for the planet, that everything below the ground is just amazingly honeycombed with all these fabulous creatures, ancient treasures, and places of discovery. And the pyramids would be that item on the surface, that visual element that would attract people to a region, especially a dead region that the society has gone away or gone completely underground as a cultist. The players would come up and they'd see on these fantastical desert plains these oases caused by the rivers that cross them and the pyramids. Now, I cannot tell you enough the magnitude of these things. Now, as a kid in the 60s, we took our Four Nations, Four Peoples books, and we would open them up and read about the different places in the world. But when we were studying Egypt, the pyramids were always fascinating to me, and the pyramids were such a magnificent thing to think about and what they represent. There's a lot of conspiracy theories about the pyramids, and certainly you can add those into modern horror, but I'm talking more about a fantasy-style game here. Now, the magnitude of the pyramids, when I finally got to visit Egypt, to actually stand in front of these things, you cannot imagine how large the blocks are and how magnificent it is to think that Stone Age people, these were people that didn't even have, at best in later generations they had copper tools. These were people that created these huge, magnificent structures with an idea of mathematics, with some trial and error, and a lot of sweat. So let's talk a little bit about the little tiny stone called Dolomite. Dolomite is something that's it's a stone that's created more in heat, where limestone and sandstone is created more with sedimentary processes. Well, there's your lesson in geology for the day. Now, dolomite being harder than limestone because it was actually forged in heat, and these stones are very small, you can simply rub dolomite over limestone and it will scrape off the limestone, that particulate element, where dolomite, the only thing you do with that is crack it. So you can have lots of people sitting around and scraping dolomite on limestone, and you can carve huge monoliths, small monoliths, very detailed etchings and bas reliefs, or you can just have enough people dedicated to doing this where you're going to make the limestone blocks. Now, this is something that probably in fantasy world you don't have to worry about, because the fantasy blocks could be created by magic, and the immortals, the gods themselves, can drop a ton of bricks right down on the people and then tell them, now you're going to put these together. And the players, of course, won't like when they get drafted to do that. What's nice about the limestone blocks and about the Egyptian knowledge of limestone and mathematics was the fact that the blocks were self-locking. Egypt had no concrete, no mortar. There's no glue holding these things together. It is the weight. It is a foundation that is perfectly flat, so that in an area like Egypt that's not really prone to seismic activity, they would stay together. And the self-locking nature of the blocks also meant that you can build the pyramid with its intended purpose of having this honeycomb of passages and corridors and sarcophagus and tombs below, yet you can also put the blocks in place so that once the final block is put in place to seal it up, it is seamless. You would never know which block out of the thousands upon thousands that come together to make these pyramids, which one was the one you needed to pull out. And you couldn't even naturally pull it out easily, because the lips that were carved into them would be pushed forward and gravity would bring them down, and then they'd lock into place. So it would be very difficult to get into an underworld. And yet, when the people had the time to sit there with a pickaxe and carve into the underworld or dig into it, that first initial tomb entrance would be the one with it be most profitable. Now, the Egyptian pyramids were trapless. It's a Hollywood convention that you have all the different traps. But we're in a fantasy realm here, and this is where my imagination was crazy, because there are so many different traps you can put along the corridors that are carved into pyramids. Let's talk first about the most easiest and most deadliest, fire. Now, all you need is an oil-based element and a spark off a flint. So it can be crafted even without the bit of magic, but just adding a little bit of magic, and you have a pyramid that can in any place become a murder hole. The fire essentially, the oil essentially drenches the party, drenches their supplies, drenches the treasure they're trying to haul out, and then a little bit of a spark later, and you have an inferno, instant damage. I always remember playing original D&D, how we all had all of these pitchers of oils that we would, bring them all out on the first mummy we met, and it seemed like, we would all be Major League Baseball stars. Throw 100 of those oils at somebody, fill the whole room with flame, not thinking about the fact all the oxygen would be eaten out. But again, we're not playing a scientific element. It's only later that you start to question some of these more childish ideas and opinions. Water. So, everything is below ground, and some of it's going to flood. Some of it's going to flood in a form of ciphers, where you're going to have to swim through a section that's flooded to re-emerge in another section of the underworld that's unflooded. It's a very unsettling thing to tell a guy in armor that in order to continue this adventure, he's going to have to jump into that pool of murky water, swim through it, and then hope he finds the entrance on the other side. This is where a few spellcasters with water breathing, or just the idea of the precognition that you can know which way you're going, that's going to come in and help you greatly. You can also try to drain it. You could try to find another part in the underworld where, you can essentially pull the cork plug on it. It would be a little bit more complicated than that, but as an analogy, it works. Sand. All the sediment could be filling up. If the pyramid itself was not built properly, the sand would be eroding, and it would fall down, and it would fill up the lesser areas. So there may be time when then players need to pull out the old shovel and just keep shoveling out. Or there may be a time where they walk into an area and one of these self-locking blocks falls into place because they disturb something like Indiana Jones' idol, and then suddenly the whole room is filling up with sand. It's a very, very classic movie trope, and it's just something that you should also have in your underworlds. As the sand fills up, it's not a quicksand type of element, so maybe it's just a matter of patience, where if the players can keep their wits together, make those rolls to not panic, that they will slowly ride the sand up to a surface area where they can find the gap on the roof to get through if it wasn't a natural trap, just one that's happening by age. Or they could end up riding the sand up to an even bigger trap. Now, in the nature of these size of these blocks that you make pyramids out of, all it takes one is just to fall, and you have a Monty Python skit of just the huge block, 10-ton weight falling down the person, and it would not stop one iota, and I doubt you would be able to get a spell out before it comes down. But rather than just killing the people in the underworld and killing your players automatically, there should probably be some sort of mechanism. It's even better if you mention to the players that this room is very unstable and the blocks above look like it'd fall at any time if something is disturbed, and then they can play sort of a thought exercise, use their magic, use their abilities, get out that 10-foot pole. I don't know why anyone needs a 10-foot pole. How do you even move around a corner? But to try to prevent the blocks and the collapse, because if the whole pyramid collapsed by what you're doing, you've just wasted all your effort. Because if that block collapses, it's like mining gold out of a mountain. It's going to be so impossible, take you decades. Pitfalls. Pitfalls, of course. Do they swing open with magic doors? I don't even think you need to do that. If you had a pitfall, and of course add the obligatory spikes on the bottom, it is Dungeons & Dragons. If you have pitfall, you can always have the players do all their elaborate nature to bridge it with a few boards and jump across it, rope swings, reliving Star Wars moments. But that pitfall is going to be there, and if you just have a water trap down the hall from it, where a column of water is opened by moving a portal out of the way or disturbing a wax seal, that water could rush down and just push the whole party like a tidal wave back into the pitfalls. Now, there's you have all the scything blades and blow darts and all these mechanical traps. Of course, they're all fiction. None of that stuff would exist. The mechanisms in the ancient world to create a spring, well, let me tell you, it's just not going to happen, especially with Stone Age people. But yeah, go ahead and add them. Why not? If you want to imagine that it's and Indiana Jones, gosh, he's got some great images of traps. If you want to imagine that these scything blades can come out of the floor and cut the party in half, lose a leg, lose a foot, add that 20 hit points of damage, take the guy's boots of leaping and striding and ruin one, darts, hit him, and with poison, hit him with aging drugs, hit him with fatigue, make them them delusional, so they attack their friends. There's all sorts of things you can do with just hardcore mechanical traps that puncture the skin of the party member. Let's talk a little bit about ramps and angles. Ramps and angles. I mean, when I went under the pyramid of Cheops, and it sounds like I'm bragging. I'm bragging. I'm just so excited. The angle of descent to get into these tombs is just, it's inhuman. I gotta believe it. There were wooden sledges that moved the carvers up and down, because they had added some modern. They didn't add modern steps. They didn't desecrate them to that degree, but they added lumbering that you could sort of step to keep from slipping. Any place, and there isn't a whole lot of water in Egypt, but who's to say these pyramids are actually in Egypt? Any place that gets wet with these ramps and angles, you're going to have accidents. You're going to have people tumbling. And if you have a guy in plate mail with a sword out waiting to kill the next Minotaur, and he just takes a simple tumble, he's taking damage. Okay, or worse, he's going to roll into his buddy and cause his unarmored magic user to take damage. So don't neglect the little things of having ramps and angles. Also, if you put enough ramps and angles, you can confuse even a dwarf on what level and where you're at in an underworld. Intrusive vegetation. Now, there's lots of types of intrusive vegetation that appear in Dungeons and Dragons. A wonderful imagination involved. To conjure ropers and the puddings and everything else. And of course, if you have a pyramid in more of a Asian or a South American setting, those pyramids, of course, are going to have all sorts of roots that are going to undermine them. And if they're in such a magical place like a pyramid, all that vegetation is going to take on anthropomorphic properties of being alive and being hungry. So whenever you have these rooms that have roots hanging from the ceiling, you probably can imagine that the party should imagine that they're going to be attacked either by those roots or by whatever eats them. And then, of course, all of the Inhuman Guardians and conjured creatures that exist in down there, and they're all sort of mad and angry that they got entombed. Or, better yet, don't try to fill up your underworld with a number of creatures that would get mad, but instead just have glyphs and magical type of traps, which as you cross them, conjure these things, bring them in from the other magical planes. Because the pyramids themselves, that's primarily what they were. They were portals to allow humans, after they die, to go on to heaven. But before I get onto that, let's not forget that old favorite magic mouth. Now, here's the thing about magic mouth. It's usually used locally, that you touch the door handle and then the orcs behind are woken up. Don't forget the fact that you maybe can trigger that magic mouth over a great deal of distance. How about the players hit a magic mouth and all it is just the trigger for it. The speaker is back in town at the priest's temple, so now the priests know that somebody has intruded. It's like you have an ancient version of armed response. So after the players hit that magic mouth, because they weren't constantly using their detect magics or just being alert, they're just trudging in there like they're walking down a thoroughfare. The magic mouth with the remote speaker access is another way to make sure that when they leave that they're getting punished or more combat to follow. Now, the paintings in all of the different tombs, and please go online, Google it, or go to some of the Egyptian tourist sites and see the actual vibrancy of these paintings. These paintings were, 6,000 years ago, some of them, and they were like they're painted yesterday. Now, that's because of the nature, the lack of humidity in the Egyptian setting, but they also had a practical purpose. The ceilings were painted like the star patterns, and the walls were painted with images of farm life. And what these represented to the people at the time was the fact that after I die, I'm going to essentially become part of this painting. Or I could live out my whole life in an Inception sort of setting where I can go through days and nights living in my little tomb, and it would become a whole virtual reality of expanding my existence, so I'm not just stuck in a hole screaming out my lungs and bored to death. The images of farm life were very important as well, because depending upon how much was invested in painting the tombs, you could have lots of breweries and wineries and people building structures, and all those things could be animated in the minds of the people that created them. So later on, the richest people would have the most elaborately painted tombs, and this could be a foreshadowing as the people move through As your players hit these early rooms and see these marvelous paintings of whole armies, they can imagine to themselves, oh boy, this guy must have been really rich to pay people to paint this, so he must have a lot of stuff that he put in the tomb. Or in a fantasy setting, that's a lot of people that could protect him and come back to life. Because all these people painted were going to be, whosever tomb it was, their servants. You were slaves in life, you were slaves in the afterlife. People did not change classification in the ancient world. It was very tough, almost unthinkable for anyone, even with the greatest of abilities, to change their station. It would happen, and then they would definitely have stories and legends about them, because everyone would want that false hope, like the lottery. But you would have these different protectors actually painted down. And when the gods were painted on the murals, and you really then had somebody who was extremely powerful, that he would think that when his time of need, he would actually have Anubis or Ra or Thoth be able to come out of the mural and protect him later in life. Now, the Egyptians had a lot of fake doors, and fake doors is really it's a tough thing. I looked online trying to find the exact term for it, because I think when I studied history, they actually had a better term for it. But let's just use the word fake door. It's a painted door. It's an imaginary door. It's part of the mural. But these were not imaginary to the people that would eventually be put in the tombs. They were actually fantasy portals that you could step through, and you could step through them definitely through death. So anyone who died in the underworld, perhaps they had a whole nother level of adventure waiting for them to travel through all these fantasy portals, or through magic. They could be opened up so that the living flesh could move through them. Now, after you get through the portal, don't just think it's going to be another room with a lot of treasure in it. Try not to turn your pyramids into just dragon's lairs, like the classical dragon lair. What you want to do is you want to know that there's a whole life on the other side of these portals. There's another campaign on the other side of these portals. You could start your campaign for the players with them entering, and I did this once, with entering them into an underworld, and there was 12 doors that connected 12 different types of adventure settings. And it's a good way also to add one-shots, is have the players in a fantasy setting move through a portal and suddenly be transformed into outer space adventure, or into a horror noir. They could be riding horses in the Wild West. It's all possible by using these sort of fake fantasy portal doors. Now, when you get on the other side of the portals, there should be definitely people that you can converse with, and the people that transition to the afterlife, they're going to want to know what happened to all their folks back home. What happened to the the armies and my friends, my buddies. So they're going to be interested in gossip, and they may even trade for that gossip. So don't neglect the fact that you don't need to turn your dungeon crawl into a dungeon murder spree. You can basically add these elements to the game, and even bring your outside adventures. Those barmaids, you're going to meet them in the underworlds as well as you explore these worlds of wonder. They'd also have connections to other people. If you can move through these doors as a magic user, you can bet your life there's going to be other people in the campaign that can use them as well. So there's going to be a whole level of intrigue of the cultists that use them, the thieves guilds that use them, and the ambassadors that use them to try to move messages and secret dispatches, or just normal diplomatic couriers to connect different places in the world. There'd be this incredible highway. In Era 10 you would call it a wormhole system, but if that's foreign to you, don't worry about it. Let's talk a little bit about the sarcophagus itself. Now, sarcophagus is just a fancy way of saying the coffin. And these were elaborately painted and elaborately carved, and the most magnificent one, like King Tut, it was actually formed with gold and gold plating. And so one of the most typical and beautiful stone to make anything out of is alabaster. Alabaster is just a fancy way of saying marble, but it's incredibly white. It's very vibrant. In the underworld fantasy setting, it should glow. You could even say that there are alabaster stones strategically placed in the hallway so that everything is lit. It gets away from the fact that not all of your characters have infravision. You have the second most popular sarcophagus material is limestone. Limestone is really weighty, but it's easier to carve than the third most popular one, which is granite. Now, granite is beautiful. Anyone that carves and polishes granite creates something that is totally luxe. And what you should also consider when you have a granite sarcophagus is how much do the players, because not all of them are just going to be greedy, I'll call it greedy-ass thieves. Not all of them are going to be greedy thieves who are going to come in there and try to bust everything apart for every nickel they can get out. There's going to be some of the party that's going to have an aesthetic value that may put out the hand going, this one we leave alone. This one is too beautiful. This image, people could even fall in love with the granite carved images on Sarcophagus. And that's not, that doesn't have to be a fantasy curse or charm. That can be just the fact, the physical beauty that people don't want to destroy. So make sure that your people with your high wisdom are, especially the lawful ones and the lawful neutral ones, are realizing, well, tit for tat. Do I want to destroy this person's beautiful sarcophagus made of granite or alabaster, only to have my own done in 50 years? Now, the lock on Sarcophagus was just weight. The weight of the limestone, the weight of the granite, the weight of the marble would just hold it in place. And they would create a little vacuum inside, so the mummy would also help to desiccate. So you have both the vacuum and the weight sucking it down. In a fantasy world, you want it to become more of a complex set of systems where levers and certain punch positions need to be activated in order to lock. You should definitely take your time with this, and if you can, draw a little puzzle. You can find puzzles online as well, and hand it to the players and make them actually figure out how to open sarcophagus. It's a good thought exercise for many of your players that are looking for that sort of activity. Others will be just bored by it and want to hit it with a hammer, but I go back to my other premise of the beauty of the thing. Why destroy something beautiful when you could even haul that out? It could be the treasure of the underworld, could be the actual sarcophagus itself. The son wants the father's sarcophagus. Your sarcophagus should be loaded with mechanical traps, absolutely in every form. It should make stuff collapse, it should make stuff fill, it should bring out water dangers, and the other thing that's great about mechanical traps is they can be remotely sprung. So the people are messing with the sarcophagus and then they hear a trumpet somewhere else in the underworld. Now that trumpet triggered to attract monsters there that will come to save the sarcophagus, or are they just suddenly the path back out is blocked by new monsters and new traps? Curses, anything magical, especially curses and poisons that you can have on the sarcophagus. You should, the whole thing could be coated with contact poison. Does it make sense that after 2,000 years it wouldn't all have dried away and blown away? Again, fantasy element. When the person puts his hand on that sarcophagus and it feels like he's touching Vaseline, he should know he's going to die. He's got maybe 10 turns to figure out how he's going to neutralize that poison, or he's out of the picture. That's why I think a dead man approach is probably the best way to approach a sarcophagus. Somebody in the party should just either by lot or by rotation or by weakest should be the person that's the dead man. He has to walk up and touch the thing and see what traps alarm. And if he's a dwarf, maybe he can sense some of the mechanical traps. If he's an elf, maybe he can sense some of the hidden nature of what's hidden that could be triggered as magical traps. You can get your best cleric sort of survey the thing, but eventually you're going to kick that thief forward and go, hey, if you touch something that feels like Vaseline, just put your arm out and the fighter will cut your hand off. After you open up the sarcophagus, you're going to find the mummy, but before you find the mummy, you could also find fake sarcophagus that have critters in them. And let's just say, if a genie is mad that he's been in that bottle all those years, especially in a freed, imagine what some demon or some monster that can't starve to death, can't die, feels like when he finally sees human flesh in front of him and he hasn't eaten for an eternity. Snakes are always good. You don't know how they got in there, but they writhe, and people are afraid of snakes. The snakes can come together. The snakes can be on the head of a Medusa. The snakes are great. They're so visual. Everyone knows a snake. Most people are afraid of them. Scorpions are good because they both have an attack, a pinch, and they also have a poison from their sting. These things, after they enter, just being exposed to the greater room can allow them to grow and transform. They can split like demons. They can be like Hydra, where you kill one, it creates another one. I think in one of the original Greyhawk or Blackmore, they talked about a well in one of the underworlds that constantly emitted snakes. And I certainly have used one time a well that constantly emits skeletons. I just thought it was such a cool thing. Although, until I had somebody milk it and just sit there over then collect experience point after experience point by killing what comes out. And beetles are wonderful. I have this great scene in The Mummy where it shows what those scarabs, those beetles can do. And, of course, I'm not talking about She Loves You, but, any insect type life. I was traveling in Egypt. I never saw an ant, and so I just finally to the tour guide. I just said, "Gosh, does this country have any ants?" She says, "Yeah, of course. They just don't come out in the sun." All right, so you got mummies. Mummies. We're going to talk a little bit about mummies. Mummies fascinate me, and many cultures actually have mummies. It's not just the Egyptians. The Egyptians just took it to level 10. The creation of the mummy was to keep the body from rotting. Rotting was scary. When you're an ancient person who relies more on a supernatural description of life as opposed to a chemical and natural understanding of bacteria, when you see a body transform rather quickly into a pile of goo, that rodent you killed and left in the trap, if you don't catch it right away, it turns to maggots. So mummies was essentially a process of saying, hey, do you want your loved ones to look like a pile of maggots, or do you want me to do something about it? Now, mummies are not zombies. They're not animated. And mummies in the fantasy world will have a soul that's still contained within the mummified form, and they'll be quite formidable. I always hated the fact that mummies were so easy to burn. Mummies shouldn't be so easy to burn. I mean, I think they're five-eyed creatures, if I remember my original D&D. Don't hold me to that. And zombies were just mindless minions, thralls of some supernatural wizard or lich. Mummies themselves should have a lich-like nature, and I think all mummies should have some sort of magical ability. They should be armed with magical weapons. But let's get into some of the myths about mummies. First of all, the Egyptians did not bury the wives in the tombs. They did not bury actual servants in the tomb. That doesn't mean in a fantasy world you don't want to just have the king die and the whole kingdom be entombed with him, still living. That's always fun. Or special guards. When my master dies, I take my own life. Seppuku, and I want to be buried with him. The tombs in Egypt, that pyramid, those great pyramids, they held one guy. They held grandfather, father, and son, 3 of them. And after that, probably they ran out of money. But ran out of local limestone. But when you have these tombs, you're essentially, you would have, there would be a lot of different places. Think of like an egg carton, I guess, if that's a bad analogy, that they would be separate. So each little tomb it wouldn't even be connected, although there would be those fake doors and spiritual connections. At one time, they tried to dig a tunnel between the Valley of the Queens and the Valley of the Kings on the other side of Thebes, on the western side of Thebes. They never completed it. But it was put in place mostly because the queen, Egypt had a number of fine queens, but the greatest was Hatshepsut. When she died, her followers, who had a very powerful cult, wanted to make sure that she didn't have to be stuck in the Valley of the Queens for all eternity, that she could walk over and visit with her ancestors and her equals in the Valleys of the King. So adding connections between various tunnels is probably a reasonable assumption in a fantasy world, and you could have those occur. They would either be previous grave robbers would create these things, or whatever comes tunneling back up from the below. I'm very fond of turning dwarves and imps, mischief makers, and they'll undermine and tunnel through all this stuff. The painted portals and the magical nature of the pigments. In a fantasy element, I think you even have forgive me if I'm pronouncing this wrong, this coeg pigment pots. Those would be mainstream in an environment campaign like Egypt. All the pigments would be magical, and they'd all have different properties of either summoning, conjuring, creating connections, allowing people to move into paintings for protection, move out of paintings when they wanted to move around, and so anything painted would have a magical element. It would be very confusing to cast that detect magic because yes. And answer your question, do you detect magic? Yes, you do. And again, the lich-like nature, I think most of the best mummies would be high, powerful, very high-level priests that died, went through many stages of resurrection before they finally gave up the ghost, literally, and were finally entombed, and they're mad. And they're searching through a fantasy afterlife, looking to be reborn. And there was this belief in ancient Egypt, that there would always be this reunion, that the life you had right now that was good and food was plentiful, and even most of the servants would see that there was a contentment that people had. The Egyptians invented beer, so a lot of contentment in beer. And so they longed for an idea that after death they could be reunited with all of their loved ones, and those that came before them and those that will come afterward. And imagine the anger created by the player characters when they come and they bust this up. So the player characters have entered a tomb because they're trying to get a +3 sword, and they destroy a tomb and take that +3 sword because they heard the legend. They paid an innkeeper to tell them about it. And then the priests show up a week, a day, a year later, and then go, oh my gosh, who desecrated, who wrecked this reunion of our ancestors? So this is where I say that you're going to have a little bit of context here. If the players are entering the underworld for a specific person and it's sanctioned by the religion, for instance, they're told, go into the underworld, bring out that +3 sword. We needed to kill the troll infestation on the riverbank, but you're going to put it back afterward, and we'll try to reward you with something else. Lawfully good characters, absolutely. But when the chaotic characters come in there and simply ransack, there's got to be some other builder of the pyramid who eventually comes in there, even the very gods themselves that are being worshipped, that will come back in and say, hey, it's vengeance time. So, canopic jars. What are canopic jars? Now, the reason why the Egyptians were so good with their mummies was embalming techniques, and they removed the liver, the lungs, the intestines, and stomach, and stored them separately because they didn't know what to do with them. If they threw them away, they thought, well, what if the person needs them in the afterlife? So they removed them, put them in their own jars, seal them with wax, set them in the tomb. What this actually did was beneficial, whether they knew it or not. Probably over time they started to realize it. That when you remove the water, and especially the bacteria related to the intestines and the stomach and partially the lungs, you, by a trial and error process, are prolonging the time that a mummy is going to stay in one piece, and able to, in a fantasy world, walk around. Now, it may sound very gross, but it's also very funny, but they did not value the brain as having any meaning. They would take this poker and stick it up through the nostrils and basically drain the brain like it was bad fluid. And the heart, the ancient Egyptians had no concept that the heart did anything. I think, which is hard to believe because you can put your hand up to your own neck and chest and feel it beating there, but they could probably think that that was a soul that moved on with the spirit. They did not associate it with an actual organ, a muscle. They just treated it like any other muscle, and they hit it with salt and more salt. They called their salt natron, and it's probably just a colloquial term for salt. And they would use this salt to desiccate everything, take all the water and everything. And where did that salt come from? It would probably come from the Aegean Sea and the Mediterranean Sea, the Red Sea. I don't think there's any natural occurring mines of salt, but there's always somebody will come online and point the finger and say, you didn't know that this existed. But this is another thing you shouldn't neglect in your campaign. That fact that in order to do things like build pyramids, you need something that's not available, whether it be those blocks they're made out of them, they had to quarry those elsewhere, or the salt. And so, you don't have to necessarily be Joe the salt peddler here, but if the salt trade is disrupted, that's another way to infuse your characters into a greater idea. It doesn't always have to be, hey, go slaughter some mummies. It could be, hey, find out why the salt trade has been interdicted. And it might be interdicted on a godly level. So, embalming. Now, I'm not going to go through all the transformation chemicals here. It's mostly just drying. If you can dry something and there's almost no humidity, and despite the Nile, there's almost no humidity, especially when you move away to the valleys and the tomb areas on the western side, which is, desert. After you go a certain amount of, not even a mile away from the Nile River, it's all just, it's amazing, the dunes that you can see and the lack of vegetation. If you take the water out of a dead being, it's not going to rot. Now you add salt to it as well to make sure that if any sort of condensation or any sort of seepage comes about, the salt's going to rip it up. And then you fill the thing with tar. Yay lordy, tar. Now, they probably got the tar from the Delta region, just from the swamps. They also probably manufactured it in small batches. They also used a lot of honey. Honey is amazing. Honey doesn't rot. Does everyone listening to this realize that honey doesn't rot? You can leave honey out. You can leave honey out for 100 years, come back and lick it. It's going to be there, although the ants may have gotten it. Honey, they used honey, and they used honey and tar in the wrappings. And the wrappings, are just, flax, a vegetable material that's formed into strips, and made their clothing out of it, and they wrapped their mummies up in it. So you would constantly just be wrapping tar and making all these sort of glue band-aids that you would cover the whole body. And there was a process on where to cover and how. But I'm sure in the training process and in all of the rituals involved with Anubis, they probably wanted to have it perfect every time, but there's humor, trial and error here, and there's also, I'm sure, people that are short-circuiting their duties. Now, the mummies themselves would be wrapped, and they would include amulets inside, and these amulets in a fantasy world would be incredibly important. So after you kill the mummies, you definitely want to cut, snip, 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 get through all that tar and everything else and pull those amulets out. And the amulets that have various powers, I would equate them to being batteries for vitality of some sort. And, of course, in the tombs themselves, after you embalm the person, you put all of his weapons, you put a mirror, you put all his cherished tokens. The riches in the tombs were just inconceivable. And the space was all jam-packed. If you look at, go online and look at, and some of the photographs of when they originally opened up King Tut's tomb and took some pictures in there before they went in, it looks like a hoarder had set this thing up, because they put all this stuff in there, knowing that when the guy finally wakes up after to take his spiritual form in death, he can fly to the stars above. He can join all the people that are drawn on his tomb walls, and he can sort of spread out. He can rebuild his chariot. He'll have some craftsmen carved on the wall that can reassemble all that. And in a fantasy world, all those things are going to be real. So when you enter that tomb at the end, it may not just be fighting that one demon with 100 hit points. It may be the fact that you now have a whole village you need to face. And gold. Oh, gold. What can we say about gold? You can have a whole lecture series on gold, but let's talk a little bit about gold. First of all, gold is great because it's soft. When you're dealing with a culture that didn't really even have the firewood and the ability to make charcoal to make something like iron, and certainly not even smelt bronze, when you hit something like gold that you can almost just hammer in place because of its softness and coat things, and gold, you can make it amazingly thin. All the gold in the world, if you put it in one room, it probably wouldn't even fill it, but you can hammer gold to such a thin element that you can, essentially gild everything. And it had an eternal luster. Gold does not tarnish. So it had sort of an absolute quality that people could look at in the ancient world, look at in the fantasy world, and go, this is eternal. And the craving for gold actually comes later. The utility of gold is what came first, again, because it did not tarnish it. If you needed to, you actually can melt and cast it as well. It melts at a low temperature. And for a woodless region like the Nile, gold became just a matter of a necessity. If you want to coat something, you can't coat it with aluminum. Oh my gosh, aluminum is actually a modern metal. But I'm getting too much in the weeds here. But you can easily trade again with you. When Egypt has an abundance of food, people will trade something they see as nice, glass beads and gold for food, and not think anything of it. And then if you trade for enough gold, or if you really want gold, you can always go out there and conquer people, but that would be a later topic. So let's get more in the fantasy element here on the ritual and spellcasting. If you got a whole culture that's dedicated not to the living, but really to the infinite amount of time you're going to have after you're dead, it's going to involve a lot of blessings. It's going to involve a lot of curses. They're going to make sure that they ensure that they're going to have forever be able to enjoy their culture now and forever, and see all those generations to come. Building pyramids also was a marvelous jobs program, and there's plenty of fine videos online that'll talk about this. The salary was beer, liquid bread, and as you would be in those months between, especially during the flooding time of the Nile, all of the people that could not work the field because the field was flooded, most of the people who even their homes were flooded when the Nile flooded on certain certain occasions, they would go and the priest would pay them in beer to basically use their strength to help assemble these tombs to honor both the gods and Pharaoh, and to a lesser degree, more and more the priests themselves were becoming entombed. So, especially as Egypt became more wealthy and powerful. The use of slaves would come much later as other nations came in, cultures came in and conquered the Egyptians. The original Egyptian pyramids, and it's controversial, but I take the philosophy and my study of it is that none of them were slaves. Now, you can call everyone a wage slave. I have to work minimum wage slave, get my beer. But no, in a fantasy world, you would certainly use non-humans. It would be helpful to have stronger giants and beasts of burden that can help drag the blocks, and of course you also have the spell casting. I think every guy that has a levitate spell or knew anything about mathematics would be hired, to cut stone and use their mind to help build these and construct these tombs. And that knowledge of a guy building the tomb and then later realizing, well, I saw what they put into it. That's how the players themselves would be alerted to some of the treasures that are involved. The guy, a guy that gets old on down on his luck, a drunk. Later in life, drunk magic user later in life, that's the worst type. He tells the players, hey, for a full round of beer here, I'll tell you some of the crud and some of the passwords to get into these temples and tombs. You would also be making deals with these Chimerian gods, because as long as the gods think that you're their guy, hey, that's my guy, that's my made man, they probably would be pretty helpful to you. It's when you sort of get wishy-washy and go, hey, I might want to trade up. That Ra's looking a little bit better, It's got better, women playing flutes. Then they would be equally as hurling the retribution. And again, I can't emphasize this enough. Most of the players don't realize how much blaspheme they are committing by entering any of these underworlds. And if they're entering the underworlds of dead cultures, well, maybe they get away with it. But if it's a fantasy world and all that dead culture decided that, hey, living the real life is just pain, let's all go to the afterlife and live in the Elysium field. When players get in there and start wrecking all that portal that creates the Elysium fields, there's going to be some additional hell to pay. So I think we cost a lot. I guess random thoughts at the end. I'm getting told by, especially my writing partner, gaming writing partner. My wife is my actual literature writing partner. I debated having her read this, but I want to keep her away from nerddom. That's a joke. The fantasy construction, wishes. Don't, every day you get another wish, if you got a ninth level spell, wow, the world would change. But those wishes, a lot of those wishes would be used to help Pharaoh obtain his everlasting life. Also, there's a permanent spell. I used to love that permanent spell. We used to sit around and argue what it could be used for. I remember a guy I used to play with, Jacob. He took the time stop spell and a permanent spell and essentially created a castle of nothing but time stop cubes. And the idea of that, we were talking about, well, would it eventually look like a big pile of leaves from all the things that blow into it? How can you actually step into a time stop cube? Because you can't really cross the advent. Well, if you want to have that debate, put a remarks in the remarks section, and I'll get one of you on Skype and we can have that debate. Again, curses and the triggers. Make sure you have plenty of triggers that trigger curses. The curses can be minor, you don't have to blind everyone with a curse, give them itchy feet. And summon your monsters. You don't need to have a living ecology in these underworlds because everything can be summoned. You could have a mastodon living 2,000 miles away, and as the players enter, especially as they cross over into one of the fake false doors into an Elysium field, there it is. They just connected to that monster, that mastodon, thousands of miles away. And the clockwork automatons. Oh boy, there were a lot of these in Empire of the Pellet Throne. And it definitely has a steampunk feel. It definitely has a horror feel. But when dolls, gosh, I will never enter an underworld that's got some dolls in it. I don't even care if they're all super valuable. The whole idea that some of the machines could come to life, the suit of armor that the hero once wore, takes on a little of his soul and continues to live on and fight these battles. It's just amazing sort of fantasy, the ideas and the imagery you can conjure from it. Writings, I didn't really talk a little bit about. If I'm going late, hopefully you watch this over a couple of days or listen to it over a couple of days, or just ignore me. The writings, a lot of the writings in the ancient world are clay tablets, which help because, again, with the desiccation, with the lack of moisture, they would last forever. The Egyptians did have papyrus, which is just, reeds that they would flatten and bleach, but most of the records that would be inside of the tombs would be tributes and praises, and I wanted to make a special point of this. Some of them would be letters of introduction. So I'm going to put on this clay tablet the right words, the right symbols to prove to my ancestors that I am who I am. Or there would be, the priests would make these special holy introductions that they, when the Pharaoh could go and introduce himself to the gods, here's my credentials. It's almost like the heralds became in the Middle Ages. People moved around, nobody knew one another, so to truly tell whether or not somebody was worthy, they would come with their written credentials. Imagine what it would be like as a thief to steal some of these credentials, and later in the campaign introduce yourself as someone worthy of talking to a god. Forget the gold, forget their peeling off the azimuth and the lapis lazuli, is it whatever, the cheap gems. Some of the things that would be written and left in the tombs would be far more valuable, the information. So when you think about further settings, imagine, a campaign where you have a world where the dead and the living live side by side. That's a lot of what ancient Egypt pictured, and bring it to life. You could also have a discovery that the undead actually feel pain, that the afterlife is incredibly worse than living life, and there could be thoughts of the players to try to change that, so that this whole idea of embalming needs to end, that all you're doing is prolonging the agony of the people, and the intrigue involved with the priesthood, because the priesthood was probably one of the major tomb robbers. After, let's take the stuff from the guy buried 400 years ago and put it in this guy's tomb, because he's going to praise us now in real life for doing so. So it was always a tremendous recycle of the riches. Again, if the players steal the riches, a lot of times they're pawning it. Who are they pawning it back to? Well, the priests for one, but also that becomes like a record, that the ancient police can be looking for. Where did you get this scarab? And of course the monsters that have been triggered by some other accident. A stone becomes loose and falls. It triggers a curse or summon spell that creates a monster. The monster doesn't have any way to sate its appetite, so it comes forth from the pyramid. It even makes its lair out of the pyramid. That's another way that you can introduce these sort of tombs and pyramids into your campaign without having the players just be grave robbers, is that they're sent to defeat that monster that is now inhabiting the pyramid by accidental release. And of course there's the whole scale movement of the tombs, the Abu Simbel. Because of the raising waters of the Aswan Dam, we had to remove that tomb in the modern world, and incredible engineering achievement to do that. They even positioned it so that it had the same effect, that at one day of the year, 3 of the gods' images are lit, and the one more evil god, I think it was a personification of Set, remained dark, to set that up mathematically so that the intent of the tomb was maintained. Imagine as well doing this in the ancient world or a fantasy world, where basically you have a temple or tomb that needs to be relocated, or it needs to be expunged. The latest dynasty doesn't want these former ancestors enjoying any sort of glory or past or potential honor. Move them. Move it all. Move these buildings. Move that pyramid. And the players then, every guy with a levitate spell is going to be recruited to help out. Well, that's about all I have to say here. I hope that was entertaining. I'll listen to it later. I may put some critical edits in it. I doubt it, Stream of consciousness for an hour or more, has its own value. Maybe somebody 100 years will hear this and go, wow, I didn't even consider that. Maybe somebody will hear this tomorrow and say, wow, this is a whole other thing I want to think about. And that's it. So, more later.